Hey, welcome back to another episode of Keepin' Cozy. Today we're speaking with General David Petraeus. He's the former CIA director as well as a 4-star general. We talked to him a little bit about his military career as well as his work at the CIA. We also talk about general career advice and leadership advice he'd give to college students. So please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and share with anyone who you think may find this interesting. Also, for the first time ever, please be sure to check out our sponsor, Cured. This week's sponsor of Keepin' Cozy is Cured Inc. Cured is a Boston-based social eating venture that reimagines the charcuterie experience. Cured creates high-quality, handmade, artisanal charcuterie buckets, boxes, and cones delivered right to your door. Cured is a centerpiece and main attraction for any event so lucky to have it. Be sure to check out their website and Instagram links in the description box below. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the episode. I'd love to welcome you to Keepin' Cozy. Thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure's mine, thanks.
So I just want to start by asking, are you keeping well? Everything, good?
I am, thanks, Jacob. As busy as ever, if anything, perhaps busier because of the accessibility that's afforded with Zoom and MS Teams and all the other applications and so forth that we use to stay connected. And you are accessible to anywhere in the world with those, and I have been.
Yeah. So, the first question I want to ask you is about just in general, distrust within the system. So Harvard University's Institute of Politics has shown that college students have a record high level of distrust with the present power structure. As someone who's been in positions of power within that same system, how do you respond to the distrust between young people and the system that, is around right now?
Well, my response would be certainly to say that this is a concern. It is significant. Needless to say, a society functions better if its citizenry supports and believes in the institutions that, if you will, govern them. And that leads me to my second point, which would be that clearly it's incumbent on those who are in government and in these institutions to regain the trust of young people in particular, but also of the citizenry writ large. Again, that's really quite an imperative, and the only way to do that is through a combination of communication that demonstrates openness, honesty, integrity, acknowledges falling short, perhaps also recognizes achievements, but again is forthright. And then, needless to say, what is most important are the actions of the institutions, which at the end of the day have to be of the type that engender trust and confidence and support.
Yeah. And, on that note, what do you think the role is of political polarization for that increasing level of distrust?
Well, the polarization that we have seen in the United States political system, the political gridlock that has been a feature of Washington in recent years, other factors are what have led to, at least in considerable part, the sense that institutions aren't worthy of our trust. And again, that's particularly the case, as you noted, with young people. And so once again, it's incumbent on those in the institutions and the institutions collectively to act in a way that regains the trust of the people, and that regains their confidence and their support.
Yeah. And, as someone who is in, as former incumbent of those positions of power, do you think it's easy to bring about change, or is that something that is going to be met with a bit of resistance?
Well, it depends on change in what. If it's change in terms of trying to exhibit, to regain the trust of the people, if it's those actions, it depends on the institution. It depends how far it has strayed, if you will, from what the people believe it should be doing, and in a forthright, impartial way, grounded in our legal system and the rights that we all enjoy. Look, as a soldier, as a commander, when we launched the surge in Iraq, we had lost the support of the Iraqi people. It's predictable that at some point, any army of liberation becomes an army of occupation.
Yeah.
And we were very much seen as an army of occupation because the mistakes that inevitably are made in combat, the ways that you irritate the people with your vehicles on their roads and sometimes knocking down their wires and all the rest of this, not to mention occasional actual combat and so forth. All of this obviously accumulates over time. And again, the people, unless you are providing some real social good for them, the most important of which is, of course, security, which we were not prior to the surge. If you recall that Baghdad alone, the capital of Iraq, was seeing 53 dead civilian bodies due to violence every 24 hours. That's out of control. So we had to regain the support of the people. We had to, this word hearts and minds, that's what this is all about. And you do that by certainly conveying what it is we intend to do, that we will strive to do, which is to secure you to a much better degree than has been the case over the past, 6, 12 or more months. And that our actions will, in fact, produce that security that will then enable reestablishment of local markets, repair of damaged infrastructure, the war damage, restoration of basic services to the best level that is possible given the Iraqi resources, reopening schools, health clinics, and all the rest of that. So there is some similarity between where we were then and what we're discussing here, where folks have lost faith in the system.
Yeah.
And the only way to engender faith in that system is by meriting it. It's by taking the actions that are also backed up certainly by forthright rhetoric and discussion and so forth. But you can't spin yourself out of this. You can't, if a situation is truly dire, we used to say you can't put lipstick on a pig. It's still ugly. What you have to do is change the situation. And when you have a really bad day, you don't go out to the podium and say, well, we reopened 3 soccer stadiums today and the soccer leagues are going again. And we're hoping the swimming pools will soon be filled for the summer and all the rest of this. Oh, by the way, we had 150 Iraqi civilians killed in 3 market bombings. No, you go out to the podium and you say, we had a horrible day today.
Yeah.
Here's what took place to the best of our understanding. Here's what we believe we should learn from this. This is what we will do to reduce the risk of this kind of bombing in the future. We appreciate your support for the restrictions that this will require. For example, no vehicles in the marketplaces. These are enormous, half-mile to a mile long markets of just street with shops on either side going back several different roads.
Yeah.
So again, that is a bit of an illustration of what it is that is required. It starts, again, you just can't have a public relations campaign. That's not what gets you out of a situation where you've lost the trust of the people. It's by your actions, but certainly those actions also need to be explained. There needs to be, again, the kind of forthright dialogue with those who are dissatisfaction, with those who have lost trust, with those who need to regain confidence. But it's a difficult process. It's never completely achieved. You're never going to get, again, 100% for anything in a democracy, but you certainly can get a much better degree of confidence and of support than was demonstrated in the survey that you referenced that was done at the Institute of Politics for Harvard.
Yeah. Well, kind of staying on that topic of conversation, the term G-man, which is used to define a government man, and back in the time of J. Edgar Hoover, it was used to define someone who was tall, lean, straight, and white with an easy to pronounce last name. during this time of increased, racial and social awareness, how do you see both the military and federal agencies making progress to change that narrative of what it means to be a G-man?
Well, I think that really all elements of government have had various programs in which they have tried to move their workforce to a position where it is more representative of what the general population is than it was previously. That takes time. I am most familiar with the initiatives that were taken in the US Army, needless to say, where I spent 37 years. And I think by and large, there have been considerable steps forward in that regard, but certainly there is still work that needs to be done. But it began with a recognition that there were obstacles, there were institutional challenges to those who didn't look like me. By the way, it's the same, of course, for women serving in the military. It's the same for gays and others. So this was an issue for those of the color of skin, probably at various times religion, social orientation, sexual orientation, and so forth and so on. And the institution has to work through the policies, the actions, in some cases, the laws, regulations that were keeping everyone from being able to have the same opportunities.
Yeah.
Certainly when I entered the military, I don't think there was any African-American four-star general in the Army. There were off and on, but now there's almost always one or two. And again, the same with women, and same with, again, a variety of other categories of individuals who can meet all of the physical requirements for whatever field, branch, skill, and therefore should be able to compete fairly with everyone else. Now in the military, in the Army in particular, this took programs like Affirmative Action, so that individuals like Colin Powell would have a fair shot. Keep in mind that when he was initially serving, and a lot of our bases for the infantry are in the South, so he would go to Fort Benning, Georgia, and he was obviously not treated equally when he was outside the gate of Fort Benning, Georgia in Columbus, with that of his white counterpart. So there were plenty of obstacles and plenty of challenges for those of different color, skin, gender orientation, and so forth. And by and large, the military has done, I think, an impressive job in providing truly equal opportunity. That's really what this is about. And there have been numerous programs to ensure that that was the case. And I think, again, there has been impressive accomplishment in that particular regard. Certainly at the CIA, we worked very hard. At the CIA in some ways, and the FBI, by the way, were ahead of the military in certain categories. But even there, again, it was a challenge to attract African Americans, and you really have to work at it. And if you don't have any role models in the upper ranks, because if you really think about why do we do what it is that we do, why did I go to West Point? People constantly ask me. Well, gosh, as I think about it, I wanted to be like Mike. In my case, Mike was not Michael Jordan. It was Mike, who was a cadet at West Point. Half of the people to whom I delivered newspapers every morning when I was a kid were either West Point graduates serving at West Point or West Point graduate retirees. Several of my teachers in high school were, because again, we live 7 miles from West Point. But a number of the teachers were retired former professors at West Point. Our high school soccer coach had actually coached the Army team to a national championship in soccer, I think, during the World War II years. And here he was, just looking for something to do. He was $1 a year. He wanted to, later in life, after retiring as a full colonel, to coach and contribute in the community. And by golly, we won the championship. So I've admired what these individuals represented. I associated that with their particular association with West Point. whether graduates or serving or what have you, and realize I wanted to be like that. Well, if there's no one like you in the upper echelons of an organization, how in the world where is the role model who inspires you? Where is Mike? Because again, we do an awful lot about those people we admire, we want to be like them. And so we need to ensure that there are people like them, again, in these various government institutions, but also in the private sector. And I'm obviously a partner in a very large global investment firm, and it's one that has, I think, quite commendable initiatives to ensure that the boards of all the companies that we own have at least two individuals who are, again, not white males, essentially. So you have to just really, with enormous amount of determination and just relentless push and leadership to ensure that there is truly equal opportunity. And it starts in our country, frankly, with, is our education system fair to all the people? Do we leave behind various segments of our population, et cetera, et cetera? So again, there's lots of areas that we need to address in this regard. We're by no means close to being where we need to be, but we have made huge strides in a number of the federal institutions, at least, with which I've been associated over the years.
Yeah, and I guess, just to ask a question off of that, you kind of mentioned some affirmative action policies. And do you think that there is a group of people who could feel as though that they're not moving forward because they don't happen to be part of a marginalized group of people? And how would you react to that?
Sure, there have been numerous legal cases. Again, none of these is ever embraced by all segments of society. If you are taking affirmative action for certain groups in society, there may be some others who feel that they don't get the advantage of others. And again, this is the kind of discussion, debate, policy, and so forth that has been challenged in courts. There's lots of litigation. Again, Harvard's admissions practices and the other Ivy's admissions practices have often been challenged. And again, that's fine. That's how we make progress in our country. It's how we resolve issues. But to come back to the very beginning, not everyone is ever going to embrace everything. That's just to be understood. The question is, again, are we reasonably doing the right thing in this regard, given the history that we have, and given the fact that there were historic obstacles, challenges, and barriers in some cases to so many actions that those that look like me take for granted. Look at the emphasis this year on voting opportunities. And again, lots of litigation around all of that. We're a country of a rule of law, and that's how you resolve these kinds of issues. But I think it's very understandable that some others will feel that that's not right, and that it's worth challenging. But there was a great, obviously I went to graduate school and did a PhD in a combination of international relations and economics. And in the international relations theory, you have these various schools of thought. And I remember one of the best essays I ever read by a fairly obscure British political theorist, if you will, Martin White, who wrote in an essay, "The answer is not to be found in either of these schools of thought." I think it was realism and idealism, but rather in the debate among them. And I think that's the approach to have in the back of one's mind. As you see, again, neither of these schools of thought is going to be remotely perfect. What emerges from the debate, the discussion, sometimes quite heated, the legal cases, whatever, is what will propel us forward. And that is indeed where the answer, I think, is to be found. And again, public opinion will sway back and forth depending on essentially the reality on the ground, as an infantryman would say.
Yeah. So, well, I guess, just to conclude, how do you lead knowing that you can't find a perfect solution, or that the answer comes through the debate, not through either of the theories?
You engage in the debate, and a leader obviously has a bit of a megaphone with which to do that. A leader has organizations with which to do that, noting that, of course, even within the organization, there may be dissatisfaction or discomfort or rejection of what it is that has been decided. But what you do is you try to make the most logical and thoughtful case possible for the particular direction which you believe the organization or institution needs to move, and then hope that you have been sufficiently persuasive to, again, attract support from a sufficient number of people,
Yeah.
so that you can move forward in the direction that you believe is right. And that's what leaders have to do. If you think about strategic leaders, you have four critical tasks. You've got to get the big ideas right. That's what we're talking about here. You have to communicate those effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization, the institution, perhaps the country. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. That involves what we normally think of as leadership. It's the example, it's the energy, it's the drive, it's the how you spend your time, it's the metrics, it's the hiring, firing, rewarding, and all the rest of that. And then there's a fourth step, which we sometimes forget or overlook, and that is to refine the big ideas and do it again and again and again. And this process is continuous. It is one that we should be aware of. I mean, this is a very good intellectual construct for strategic leadership, say what I was privileged to exercise during the surge in Iraq or surge in Afghanistan. But it's also applicable to the kinds of issues that we're discussing. I mean, there are debates about the big ideas. And from my experience, I was never able to sit under the right tree and get hit on the head by Newton's apple fully formed. I'd get hit on the head by a seed of a big idea or a kernel, and then you have to shape it. It's an iterative process of gradually building out the big idea, which is generally best done very inclusively, very openly, very transparently, because you want everyone at the very least to feel that they've at least had a chance to contribute to the debate, to the discussion. You don't want people feeling that they're outside the tent, because you know what people do if they are outside the tent. So you want them inside the tent. And then as you finally resolve the big idea, which strategic leaders uniquely do have to do eventually, you do have to make decisions, then you've got to try to communicate it as effectively as you can. Then you have to oversee the implementation, and then you determine how to refine it and do it again and again and again. And again, it's a wonderful intellectual construct to apply to any number of issues, tasks, and certainly to strategic leadership. And for what it's worth, there's a website that we built. I was a fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard for 6 years, and we built a website on that subject using the surge in Iraq as an example, but also Netflix with Reed Hastings and some other examples as well. And think about that process, that if you don't get that fourth task right, you can end up like Kodak, which reportedly had over 2,000 patents on digital photography, but didn't change the big ideas rapidly enough, and it sort of got overtaken by other companies that chose to embrace digital photography sooner than did Kodak.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned, you have to eventually make a decision. And my question to that is, what about the people who disagree with you, even when you do go to make that decision?
Sure.
The guys who
again,
they're left behind.
You want them to, at the very least, you want them to feel that they had an opportunity to express their view. Look, there were presidents of either party who didn't embrace fully what it was that I advised. But I always was satisfied that I'd had an opportunity to have dialogue with them, to lay out the reasons why I recommended a certain course of action. And even if they didn't pick it, because of course they do have much broader concerns than did the commander of a single battlefield or a single country. They've got the entire world. They have politics. They do have to worry about that. They have fiscal deficits, strain on the force, opportunity cost, congressional dealings, alliance dealings, all of this they have to take into account in a way that is much more pressing than the considerations that I looked at. And they understood that the basis of what I was providing to them was the facts on the ground and the mission they'd given us in our troop to task analysis and so forth.
Yeah.
So again, as long as you feel that you've had an opportunity to contribute, to be in part of the discussion, which is why I said that process of determining the big ideas should be as inclusive, as open, as transparent as you can possibly make it. I mean, when we published the counterinsurgency field manual, when I was a 3-star between the 3 and 4-star tours in Iraq, there were people that were critical of it. But what we did is we reached out to them and we said again, okay, why are you criticizing this? I mean, there was one person who's a respected individual who said it's too soft. You're not doing enough about killing the enemy. So we did a word search and we came back and we said, well, kill is in there. It's on average 1 per page. Is that not enough for you?
Yeah.
Well, then sort of grudgingly, but you have to engage them. And we would bring them out to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is where the headquarters for that assignment was, and sit down with them and then hear their concerns, engage them. We didn't convince every last one of them, but we certainly convinced more than we would have had we not done that. And at the very least, they would say, hey, at least they listened to me. At least I had a chance to offer my criticisms. And that's, again, what leaders have to do. And certainly those who are leading institutions owe it to the people who are affected by those institutions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the second half of the podcast is more focused on specifically advice for students. As someone who's in charge of KKR's Global Institute, how do you see students' lives changing due to increased global connectivity?
Well, certainly there is an opportunity. The information of the entire world is at your fingertips, or at the end of your mouse, or whatever device you're using. And so that's an extraordinary difference over even when I was in graduate school just a few decades ago, where you had to go to the library, took notes by hand. And I mean, we just were getting email when I think I finally had my dissertation approved. So this is a vast change. But the challenge now is that there's so much information out there that you have to be, you have to understand, first of all, what is it? What's the orientation of the source of this information? It's a little bit about consuming media.
Yeah.
I mean, we should be very conscious of the orientation of different media. I mean, it's pretty accepted right now that, if your views are aligned with one particular, say, political party in this country, you'll watch one cable news network. And if they oriented with the other one, then you'll watch another cable news network. And then there may be another that's sort of in the middle, along with the main channels that we always used to have decades ago. But the same is certainly true of whatever social media we're consuming. And we have to be very conscious that you can end up in silos, in echo chambers. So that, I've actually felt that there should be some kind of course on media consumption, just as I strongly believe we need to resume more education on civics, because I think that in many cases, those who have had to study for the citizenship exam understand the branches of our government and the responsibilities of different institutions better than some who gain citizenship by being born here.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you think that's something that should happen at the university or earlier?
I think it's probably at all levels. I think it's something that has to be reinforced. And again, it's something we should be very conscious of. It's very easy to, again, just listen to those voices that are similar in thought or orientation to yours. But obviously you're missing part of the debate if that's the case. So I think it's a pretty good idea to switch back and forth between channels, social media, and so forth. Again, certainly there will be those that may be so far out on either side that they, in your view, are not worth listening much to. But again, I think you need to ensure that you're getting all views. And I do think that this is a huge strength. I remember going to graduate school, and even though I'd served overseas already in Cold War Europe, um, I found there it was what I called an out of my intellectual comfort zone experience, which is what I think all students should seek because they're incredibly developing. What I found were seriously bright individuals at Princeton who saw the world through a very different prism than that through which I viewed the world. And it was a real intellectual wake-up call. And I'd come just from our staff college, which we had about 1,100 students in the class. And, we thought a serious debate was actually something that was like this. And, you go to a civilian graduate school and the debates are like this. The differences are really profound. And by the way, again, these are thoughtful, reasoned, very, very bright individuals. And it's pretty salutary to have that kind of experience. And when people ask me, when I was in the 2-star tour in Iraq, when we did the invasion of Iraq, and I was privileged to command the 101st Airborne Division, and then we went north to Mosul and Nainawa province, and things went pretty well for us. In parts because a lot of us had done some of what we were doing before in places like Central America or Haiti or Bosnia or Kosovo or what have you. Had studied it, had trained for it, and so forth. But what had really made the difference for me was this experience of civilian graduate school. So I wasn't stunned to find people who, again, worship through a different, and by the way, you had many different faiths. Mosul is the melting pot of the Middle East. It's where all of the different civilizations, fault lines came together. So you had not just Sunni Arabs and Shia Arabs, you had Shia Turkmen, you had Christians of various different faiths, you had Shabak, you had, again, all of these different Kurds of, again, different faiths and different political parties, Yazidis, and on and on and on. And that's before you even get to the political parties, the districts, and the other entities that comprise a society. And so again, having had that civilian graduate school experience, and also having seen a counterinsurgency briefly in Central America, having served as the force operations officer for the United Nations force in Haiti, not the US force, although we had a US component underneath the headquarters, and then to spend a year in Bosnia to see other endeavors in the Balkans. All of these were hugely formative intellectually for me. But at the end of the day, it was back to this graduate school experience and very basic concepts of political philosophy, such as, majority rules, but minority rights, and then free market economics. And we actually, because keep in mind, if you're in the occupation force commander, which is what we were for that initial period, that meant I was the executive, legislative, and judicial for Nainawa province and northern Iraq, in a very, very challenging location. So, for students, constantly look for the out of your intellectual comfort zone experience, constantly go where you are in the minority. I went to Princeton, in fact, instead of Harvard, because Harvard had a huge number of fairly senior officers who were there for the War College fellowships, nearly 20 of them. I was just a captain. And I thought, why would anybody at Harvard pay any attention to a captain if you've got all these lieutenant colonels and colonels who have actually done policymaking jobs as outer office people or what have you, as opposed to a company commander, former company commander or something like that. So again, it was really a great experience in that regard. And it's something that I commend to students. In addition to just basic analytical skills, communication skills, writing, briefing, and so forth. When I taught at the Honors College of the City University of New York for 3.5 years, I realized that what I needed most of all to convey to them was, of all things, how to write a policy memo, how to brief it. These were very, very bright students that had to compete fierce competition to be among those that are in the honors college, and then they had to compete to be in my course. They all had a full scholarship and various other support. But I recognized that, again, they hadn't, in many cases, maybe half of them had not had to write actual policy memos or brief them. And so we gave a class in the very first day. One of the most successful students I ever had, who happened to be in the first semester, would come back and he would actually teach how to write a memo and how to give a briefing. And he did it by giving a briefing. So those are not skills to be diminished. These are very important skills. I don't care what field you end up in. You can be in the hardest of sciences, in engineering and STEM and all the rest of that. At the end of the day, you're still at some point going to have to convey ideas, communicate principles and the results of research and analysis, and you have to be able to do that effectively.
Yeah, and just listening to you answer that question, it seems as though you've had a career where you've been able to go and travel the world due to your work with the military. Do you think that's something that's going to be normal for civilians in the future because of the increased connectivity?
Well, it has been, certainly. Clearly, we don't know what the long-term implications of the pandemic will be. My suspicion is that there will be enormous pent-up demand for tourism and travel, but that we may not travel quite as much for business as we used to, because there will be a bit more of a hybrid model to some of the conferences. Look, I had the craziest of travel schedules until mid-March. I would usually stop in 25 different countries or so, thereabouts, give or take a few. Some of those as many as 6 to 8 times, say the UK, every major city in America. And you had these crazy schedules where you'd work all day in New York, through a dinner, you'd race out to Kennedy International, you get the last flight to London, you'd arrive, go to a hotel, shower, change, go to a meeting, a conference, to a lunch with somebody, and race back to Heathrow, catch a flight back to New York so you can do something after dinner in New York. Again, this is now I look at it and say it's lunacy. Why couldn't I just do this by Zoom or teleconferencing? But in the pre-pandemic, we felt that we had to be there. I think that the new normal, the normal that we arrive at after the pandemic, is finally in our rearview mirror, and after the economic downturn has come back, that new normal is not going to be the old normal. I think there will be modifications on it. And I think one of those will be that we may not do quite as much, even domestic, much less international business travel. But again, we'll see what evolves. And certainly there will be the opportunities to travel fairly inexpensively, as there were before the pandemic, to see the world. And I think that opportunity is very much still going to be there.
Yeah. Well, bringing it back to specifically college students, you often say that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. However, the class of 2020 has found their years of preparation has met an economy lacking of the traditional opportunities that were afforded to you, every other year. What advice would you give to this unlucky generation?
Well, I mean, the obvious advice is to make the most of the opportunities that are still there. The fact is that the pandemic and the resulting economic downturn, and the steps we've taken to try to contain the spread of the pandemic, reduce it, and so forth, that these have created new opportunities. It's a fact that certain sectors have done much better during the pandemic than they would have had there not been a pandemic. And then there are many sectors, certainly, again, the hospitality industry, tourism, travel, big entertainment venues. I mean, there's a huge number of the services area, including the airline travel, that these have been hurt very badly by this. And it's not clear that they will come back fully to what they were before the pandemic. So recognize where the new opportunities are. Do what you can to prepare to make the most of those, so that you can indeed be seen as being lucky. Yes, look, luck does play a role. There's no question that timing does matter. there, but for a few months either way, I might not have been the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, which would mean that I wouldn't have gone back right after that tour as a 3-star, and I wouldn't have gone in, and eventually wouldn't have been the person whose name they settled on when the situation was very dire to try to retrieve a very desperate situation in Iraq. I mean, we were on the edge of a full-blown Sunni-Shia civil war, and Ambassador Crocker, the greatest diplomat, I think, of his generation, and the greatest with whom I was ever privileged to soldier. And we were in a pretty difficult situation at the outset. And a lot of people will say, gosh, he was lucky. It's easy to take over when you're really all the way down, because there's only one way and it's back up. Actually, not so. As I told Congress, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And the bad guys are going to fight us for these areas that we have to get back into. We have to secure the people, and we can only do that by living with them. And we're going to have to fight to reverse all of the consolidation on big bases that we've done over the course of the last year and a half or 2 years. So again, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. All you can do is prepare to the best of your ability, and then certainly hope that there will be some timing, some opportunities, what have you, that present themselves on which you can capitalize because of the preparation that you have done. And that is, again, the definition of luck. And certainly, if one prepared for the old normal, you may not have been prepared for what the emerging new normal opportunities will be. So recognize that and figure it out. Our firm in mid-March, as with all the others in New York, shut down, closed our offices, sent us all home with an iPhone, an iPad, and a laptop that had, again, Zoom and MS Teams and all these other applications and programs that enabled us to continue to communicate quite effectively. And it took us a week or two to just sort out what is our new battle rhythm, our new schedule, what are our activities going to be, how are we going to operate? Will we have the confidence to invest large sums of money in companies whose CEOs we may not have met in recent weeks or months as this went on?
Yeah.
And lo and behold, we've figured out how to do that, as have all other firms and all other institutions have figured out, again, how to operate in this particular set of circumstances. In some cases, people having to continue, the truly key and essential workers, that for frontline individuals in this particular fight against a pandemic, and then others who could perform their normal duties without being in an office, without traveling the way that we used to. But again, now taking advantage of the opportunities. As I mentioned, I said I'd be happy to do that event in Mumbai the next time I'm in Mumbai. Well, that trip got canceled. So what did they say? Well, why don't you do it by Zoom? Just get up a little early so it's not too late for us out here, and you can do that. I did. It's the same day that the folks in Berlin had scheduled me, and we did that by Zoom. And then, we did one in New York that night with a bunch of other calls and Zooms in between during the day. So we've all adjusted. The question is, how effectively, can you adjust? Is it possible? Many of us, it's quite a privilege to be able to do your job in the way that we are, frankly, compared to those whose jobs have literally gone away in so many of these sectors in the services side of our economy. As we mentioned, if you're in the hospitality industry, the travel and tourism, all the rest of that.
Yeah. Just going back to your specific career, what were you most afraid of when you first started out?
Well, I think what any person embarking on a career is worried about is whether you will measure up. Can I, if you will, achieve a degree of success? Can I progress? Can I demonstrate what is necessary? Can I inspire a platoon of 43 non-commissioned officers and enlisted men, paratroopers in my case? How will they react to me? Will they dismiss me as some wet behind the ears West Point second lieutenant? How do you establish yourself in their eyes? How do you again, a reputation, a record of achievement, and all the rest of this. Can I compete? While recognizing that you don't just compete to be the best in an individual activity all the time, you also often compete to be the best team player. And look, I think anyone who doesn't have those nagging doubts in the back of his or her mind isn't really being realistic. You should never, ever, you might be quietly confident, I think I can do this, but it shouldn't be, I'm certain I can do it, because there is no certainty.
Yeah.
So I think that's the way to approach as you start a new career. And, I've changed professions literally, and obviously there were doubts as I drove up to the CIA headquarters for the first time, not in uniform. I decided that it was important. I sat with President Obama and we agreed that I should retire. You could actually stay in uniform and do that job, and others have, but we both thought it would be best to do that, and also to leave behind all of the talent that I'd attracted over the years that used to thankfully go with me to different jobs and so forth, often on short notice, such as the one to Afghanistan, which was, a week's notice. So again, there should always be that question, and it's part of what spurs us. I mean, it's part of what drives you, that you want to measure up and that you're going to do your very best to do that. But I mean, there's also, you do sometimes have to also recognize that all you can do is the best you can do.
Yeah. So just to conclude, 2 more questions. As someone who's faced his fair share of professional knocks, how are you able to not let yourself succumb to negative situations?
Well, you succumb to negative situations. You are in a negative situation. And the question is, how do you deal with that? And look, anybody who leads any really big organization, especially in war, in combat, that organization, individuals in that organization will make in some cases, catastrophic mistakes, strategically significant mistakes. You will suffer setbacks. You're going to suffer tactical reversals. You're going to sustain enormous casualties and all the rest of this. And you might feel at a point, and we did early on as we were trying to get back into these neighborhoods to secure them and the bad guys are fighting us, you feel as like you're a boxer, with your hands up over your head, and you're just getting pummeled all over, and you're in the corner and you can't get out. Eventually you do. You have to have a degree of resilience, and then you'll make mistakes, and I did. And when you do that, you've been knocked to the canvas, or you knocked yourself to the canvas. You've got to take stock of where you are, understand what transpired, learn from it, take the remedial actions, apologize to folks if that is warranted. But eventually you've got to get up off the canvas and dust yourself off and, pick up your rucksack again and resume the march. That is much easier said than done. That can be extraordinarily challenging and excruciating to experience, but that's obviously the sort of the intellectual explanation of what it is that you have to do. And again, anybody that leads a large organization is going to experience that. I mean, this life and leadership are not about responding to victories and successes, and it's not full of endless high five moments. Again, there are setbacks, shortcomings, mistakes, missteps, some that you make, some that others make for whom you're responsible. I remember one of our soldiers used pages from the Quran for target practice. Every small base that we had always had a 25-meter range, so you could keep the zero of your weapon constantly really zeroed. And so we put a lot of premium on that. Well, for some unknown reason, he decided to put the pages up there and shot at them. And of course, a local national worker found that and rightly reported it. And the next thing you knew, I was apologizing to the prime minister of the country on camera. And the president of the United States was calling him apology. Those things happen. You try always to mitigate them. You try to ensure that your organization is sensitive to context that you're in and the circumstances and everything else. But again, as I said, life is not full of endless successes and high five moments. And the measure of leaders, I don't think, is how you respond to success. It's how you respond to setbacks, failures, and your organizations and your own mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, kind of to end, what is it like becoming a successful person or becoming an accomplished person? And what made you most fulfilled?
I would suspect it's an interesting question. I'm not sure it's one I've had before, but I suspect that most folks who have achieved a degree of success, of, I don't know, fame or notoriety or whatever it may be, would say that they're deathly afraid of that all going away, and they try harder. I mean, think about people who are at the top of their game in any walk of life, and it's not, what did you do a decade or 5 years ago or last year? It's what have you done lately? Think about that in the sports world. Think about it in the investment world. Think about it in the academic world. What was your latest book? Oh gosh, 10 years ago? You haven't done anything since then? So I think there's probably, once again, it may give you a degree of confidence. It may give you certainly a platform. It might give you a degree of receptiveness, welcome, or what have you. You certainly might get a fair number of invitations, but at the end of the day, you know that you're only as good as your last game. You're only as good as your last, again, job. You're only as good as your last investment, your last written project, whatever it may be. And so I think that's, how I would describe being at a reasonably, high level of achievement. And then, what gives you, well, there's many different elements that, give you, I don't know, satisfaction, a sense of achievement. I mean, it can be family, it can be our grandkids that we have, with one more on the way this week. It can be watching your kids as they go forward into the world, and, and what a challenging world it is right now, but they figure out ways to do things. By the way, I'm also a private venture capitalist, invested in about, I think it's 17 or 18 startups. And I love watching, again, these are strategic leaders, by the way. If you're the founder of a startup, you are a strategic leader, even if it's only a handful of people. And to see them, that's exciting. To help them is exciting. And then there's obviously various professional accomplishments. There's physical accomplishments. I mean, no one can ever take away from you that you ran a marathon in 2 hours and 50 minutes and 50 seconds or whatever it was, or these other, academic or professional achievements and so forth. But at the end of the day, I mean, what mattered most in my profession during my time in it was actually the surge in Iraq. And, what an extraordinary privilege to lead that together with Ambassador Crocker, a true comprehensive civil military campaign with over 165,000 American men and women in uniform, and tens of thousands of other coalition members, and 100,000 contractors and everything else, in a desperate situation, and which, again, they helped the Iraqis reverse and gave them a whole new opportunity in the wake of the toppling of the Saddam regime. And again, that was I think if you ask anyone who was part of that, or most, again, because as we discussed, you're never going to find universal agreement with anything, but most of those who participated in the surge felt that they were part of something very special, that it was a mission larger than self, that it was a privilege to perform that mission with others in uniform who felt the same way. And frankly, that it was a privilege to do it at a time when Americans, even if they disagreed with the policies we were implementing, all generally agreed that they should appreciate and demonstrate gratitude for the service of those in uniform. So that was a pretty extraordinary experience. It's very difficult to top that one, frankly. And to have been the one who was privileged at that time, and then to do it again, if you will, in Afghanistan, very different circumstances, very different context, very different challenges. Those were, pretty extraordinary experiences. And I'll always be grateful for having had those opportunities to serve and to do so with others who raised their hand and took an oath of service at a time of war, knowing that they were going to be deployed to those war zones.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, sir, and for your service to the United States. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, the service was a privilege, as was being with you on your podcast. Thanks.